Everyone. Thank you very much for joining in. There's more people coming up now. Everyone knows the procedure. We're recording the presentation by Lars Rüpke today, but we will not record the questions. So in case you feel like you don't want to be recorded, that's no problem during the question time after Lars's talk. Also, we'd like to ask you to keep your microphones muted, and for the sake of the bandwidth, please also switch off your video. I will keep mine working so Lars has something to look at, but other than that, please switch it off. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Lars Rüpke. We realized part of a common paper, but have never really met and have always missed in Kiel. He studied geophysics and marine geophysics in Kiel and Brest, so between Germany and France, and then did his PhD with Jason Phipps-Morgan at Geomar on fluids in subduction zones and combining the geodynamic modeling and the petrology of these. Then he went to Oslo from 2005 to 2007 did senior research at the physics of geological processes at Oslo University, so mainly dealing with rifting and passive margin development. Before he went back to Kiel from 2007 to 2011, leading a junior research group within the famous Future Ocean Cluster at the university on fluid flow and seafloor resources. So kind of the initiation of his hydrothermal career, some of which he will talk about today, I'm sure. And since 2011, he's professor and leader of the seafloor modeling group at Geomar, which kind of combines models with the data to investigate the role of the ocean floor and the Earth system as a whole. And without further ado, Lars, the stage is yours. So please go ahead. We're looking forward for an interesting talk.
All right, thanks a lot. So hello, everyone. I'm Lars Rüpke from the Geomar Research Center in Kiel, Germany. And I'm really happy to present in the seminar on mid-ocean ridges. And it's really good to see all this renewed and continuing interest in mid-ocean ridge science. The aspect of mid-ocean ridge science that I want to present today are submarine hydrothermal systems associated with mid-ocean ridges. And in particular, I will show you how we can use numerical models to combine different data sets and, in the best case, jointly interpret models and data to understand how these systems actually work. The work I'm presenting has been done mainly in the hydrothermal modeling team in Kiel. And what I'm presenting here is basically my narrative around it. This is why I think we are doing all the science. The work itself has been done mainly by the people mentioned on the slide. There's Jörg Hasenclever, who is doing really cool new models on 2D and 3D multi-phase flow modeling in hydrothermal systems. Falco Fehling, who is finishing his PhD, has developed our initial solver for multi-phase flow and implicit calculations of multi-phase flow. Shikui Go is a postdoc in our group here, and he is mainly doing all the open source stuff, making new solvers and also making open source versions of the equation of state. And then there has been many more, especially from the geo departments here, helping me to understand the data and the various aspects of hydrothermal systems. So let's go. By now we find hydrothermal systems at ridges all over the ocean floor and basically over all spreading rates. We have now found them in various ways in all the oceans and in all the ridges at all spreading rates. We also find them in a few other settings like back-arc settings and rifts, but now we basically have found them everywhere. When you think of why we look at these systems, personally, I was definitely attracted to how they look. Just if you see these spectacular black smokers and the videos of them that are now available, it's just amazing. I mean, who wouldn't want to study them and understand how they work? What I find cool is that people from so diverse backgrounds think the same way. They see these systems and they also want to understand them. And they are biologists and microbiologists that look at the ecosystems and the macrofauna and all the biology associated to those vents. You can have a look at them from an economic geology perspective to look at the massive sulfide deposits associated with black smoker systems. My personal first experience was as a parameterized cooling term in geodynamic models. That was my first initiation to hydrothermal systems. And that is just, if you think about how the Earth is losing its heat, there's a big component of fluid flow in there. And then some of us that are online have been involved in hydrothermal iron in the Earth system that has been mainly pushed through the GeoTraces program, where you now find that hydrothermal iron is detectable across the ocean basins in the water column, and that it most likely plays a role in modulating primary production in the deep ocean by where phytoplankton growth is limited by the availability of iron. So there's a big connection across the Earth departments and motivations to study these systems. When we study them, there are all sorts of ways we can do that, and that reflects the diverse backgrounds of people looking at hydrothermal systems. We can look at the vent fluid chemistry, which is shown up to the left. And what is interesting is that basically no two vents ever share the same composition. We find trends in what the chemistry looks like in the vent fluids, but basically every vent is different. And that makes it interesting and hard at the same time. We can look at the seafloor sampling, we can sample these chimneys, we can sample the rocks around. There's also some information from shallow drilling and sometimes from ODP drilling into how these rocks look like that are deposited or involved in the hydrothermal systems. Especially with the advent of the cabled observatories and some of the focus sites that existed also for the rich 2000 people, that we have time series of vent fluids, and I will come back to that at a later stage, that not only we get like snapshots on what the vent fluid chemistry is, but we also see how they basically evolve with time. And these evolutions and response to short-term perturbations like earthquakes and eruptions, they tell us a lot about what is actually happening inside. There's obviously a lot of geophysical imaging. I don't know if you have seen this cool Nature paper from the Norwegian team in Johansen from 2 years back, where they imaged the structure of the moon's ridge beneath Loki's castle, where you get an idea of what the kind of inner workings of these slow spreading ridges is. And you see a little bit these tentative black arrows of where maybe hydrothermal fluid flow might take place. And part of this talk is all about kind of drawing better arrows. I have nothing against these arrows, but we tend to kind of draw these arrows in the cartoons. And I want to show you how models can help to draw them maybe in a more physical way. And again, no criticism of this. I have nothing against those. If you make field work, I'm not a big field guy. If I ever go, I really like ophiolites. Being in Oman, you see these stockworks or the black smoker zones. It's really nice. You can really understand how the sequence of the ocean crust is. And there are also these anecdotes that ancient settlements were actually attracted to these black smoker root zones in the stockwork because they were attracted to the kind of colorful mineralizations around those zones. So also interesting topic, but not for today. And finally, there is a high resolution bathymetry, and I will show you later examples of how with these new imaging capabilities, how we can really instruct models in a better way and see connections between structures we can image at the seafloor and what might be happening below. Yes? All right, so all of these data sets, we study them with different motivations, with different techniques, and in the end, it comes down to the question, so how does this hydrothermal system work? And there are tons of different cartoons drawn where you put all this complexity in. And this is how this one example that I found on the internet, but there are many more on how we can maybe think of how these systems work. And the question is the question for me is, like, can models help us to understand these systems? That's basically what's driving me. I mean, I have a numerical background, so obviously that's my direction on these systems. But for me is how can these models help us to understand these systems? Can they help to connect dots of various data sets that have been done independently? Or can we guide our interpretation by understanding what are the physics about it? What kind of are the hydrological regime at depth? What are kind of plausible flow pathways? And these kind of thinking, I think models can play a role. And there are basically two types of models that I want to talk about and that have their different approximations, their different strengths and limitations. And one type of kind of workhorse type model that many groups are doing and that have been around for quite a while are these large scale pure water hydrothermal convection models. They are based off Darcy flow. they make the simplifying assumption of pure water. We will talk about that more later. This assumption is made because then if you stay above a certain pressure, you don't have to worry about boiling and condensation processes, and the numerics become much, much easier. That's a strong assumption, but still they can be very useful. And there have been many iterations of these models from different groups. I chose mostly our models. At least I showed the one from the technical university team in Switzerland. They have done a lot of great work on this in 2D, 3D, and later all the multi-phase work on finding these kind of pipe-like structures which form, if you have a high heat input, like at a fast spreading ridge, you get these pipe-like upwellings with downflow around it. We have looked into fault-controlled systems where kind of variations and permeability in the subsurface are guiding flow pathways. And then a model that I will talk a bit more about later on the EPR, where we think these kind of what we call a hybrid flow model can explain some of the observations that we see there. These models, they are basically done. They work in two ways. One is they have some kind of free convection mode that is more like on this side. If you heat from below, they go into the kind of free convection. And this free convection is guided by your fluid properties. They are guided by the equation of state of pure water inside. And the second thing that really affects them are heterogeneities in the permeability structure, as for example, a fault zone. Let's quickly talk of what's inside in terms of pure water conditions. That if you look, for example, at a phase diagram like this, if it's pure water, there's no chemistry, there's just pressure and temperature. And then in the space, you see the different phase fields. At below 2,200 meters water depth about, you are in the what is called the subcritical zone, where you have liquid water in the low temperature regime and vapor in the high temperature regime. If you go beyond the critical endpoint, you get into the supercritical domain, where you have like a gradual increase from a liquid-like fluid into a vapor-like fluid inside there. The nice part about this is that this is all single phase. So this thing goes progressively from being liquid-like into vapor-like without a full phase transition. And that makes life much easier in terms of modeling. And most of the hydrothermal upflow go along flow paths like this yellow, like this white one here, which is one of the benchmarks shown in the middle. And we can simulate these systems using the full thermodynamic properties of pure water in a relatively easy way, because we remain in the single phase domain. For those that remember these papers, I think this is still a fantastic paper that looked at the first time presented this it's 20 years by now, amazingly, that presented this in a full way of how the thermodynamic properties affect upflow. You could probably not read this in the bottom here, but basically all the properties like density, viscosity, enthalpy, specific heat, all these properties are function of pressure and temperature. And they align in such a way that in these free convection models where you heat from the bottom, it's about the 400-degree isotherm that really wants to go up. That's the one that optimizes buoyant transport of heat. And that means that these black smokers, they basically rise with about 400 degrees. And then depending on where you are in the phase field, there's a bit of adiabatic cooling. And then we get venting of like 350 to 400 degrees. In these single phase models, it's really hard to make higher temperatures. In multi-phase, there's some room for that. But basically, this is the thermodynamics behind it that explain that upper limit to what we observe in black smoker temperature. So this is what's inside these pure water convection models. And later I will show you examples of how we can use them to connect to data ports. We are trying to make most of what we are doing open source and available to everyone. And Shikuri has just published this hydrothermal foam paper and geoscientific model development. If you look at these websites, hydrothermalfoam.info and our lecture notes from this year's lecture at the University of Kiel, you find a lot of resources of how you can set up these models yourself. And I think now it's very easy to do 1D, 2D, 3D runs on this. It's all parallel. It builds on the OpenFOAM framework, where you also find a lot of documentation for. So I hope this makes it easier for many groups to look into this, play with them, and see how changes in permeability affect fluid flow and what the thermodynamics do. The second type of model is what's much more complex, and those are all the multi-phase models. And a lot of the pure water models I've just talked about, they always draw the criticism that we know there's salt in the sea, and if we put salt, we get all the phase transitions, and this is what we really need to put in. And that's of course all true. I still think, as I show you later, I think some problems can be handled in these single phase systems, and other systems really need to be modeled in a multi-phase way. Especially when we talk into model data integration, like we want to integrate stuff like this, where you see the correlation between iron transport and chlorinity. You see the trend, how the iron likes to go where the salt is. So if we want to understand how metal is transported in these systems, since we are still short of having a full thermodynamic description of all of that, at least with the salt, we could have proxies on how these systems work. So this is what we want to put in. Unfortunately, putting that in requires dealing with this horrible equation of state. And horrible, I of course don't mean literally. Thomas Dries and his team have given the community this fantastic equation of state that resolves the system water plus NaCl over the entire pressure, temperature, and salinity range that's relevant for magmatic hydrothermal systems. They've also went further and put that into their CSMP++ toolbox that they have used over a few years, or maybe 5 to 10 years now, on looking at multi-phase flow using this equation of state. And this is one example from Philip Weiss, also a really cool paper where they put in dynamic permeability models and then looked for conditions for kind of metal mobilization and redeposition, how you can relate that to the different multi-phase flow. There's also the Fishes code from Kayla Lewis and Bob Lowell that can handle that. And we have our own version of that Falco Fehling developed in his PhD, where we use an implicit scheme to also implement this equation of state, and then you can look at these systems. So let's also have a closer look into how this works, how these multi-phase and equation of state works, and under which conditions we really have to deal with this, and maybe where we can get away with a kind of more pure water one. And after that, I will finalize my kind of introduction on the methods, and then we have to look at a number of case studies applying these techniques. All right, so let's have a look at the system a little bit more. Let's dive a little bit deeper into the thermodynamics of just water plus salt. And it's already amazingly complicated, at least I find that. So if you look at this 3D phase diagram, temperature increasing in that direction, pressure going up there, and then salinity going from pure water to pure salt over there, you find these different phase regions. And this black curtain is, for example, the liquid plus vapor coexistence. Then in green, we have the halide coming in, and the blue is a vapor plus halide field. In principle, you can describe the system very well in terms of pressure, temperature, and salinity. There are just some conditions where that doesn't map uniquely. The most famous example of that is pure water, where you cannot tell the fluid state just from temperature. Like if the system boils, you don't know if it's all vapor, if it's all liquid. To resolve that, you would have to go to an energy-based scheme. In the system salt plus water, there are two other regimes where that happens, and that is in the liquid vapor halide coexistence. So when we have all three phases present that can form, that's also an isothermal phase transition, which means that the PTX mapping does not work very well inside the three-phase regime. And because of that, Falco, Jörg, and me have tried different ways of doing this, and Falco in his PhD, Falco Fehling in his PhD, has then translated the PTX equation of state into the PHX equation of state, where we replace temperature with enthalpy, so with energy as a primary variable. And then these are different slices at different depth levels. This is at 10 MPa, so 100 bars, somewhere down there. This one is a bit higher, somewhere there. So these are slices of constant pressure. And then you can see how these three-phase regimes are also resolved. You can fully calculate the fluid state also under these three-phase conditions. You can do that at higher pressure, and that works quite well. This, to give you an example of how you have to, or how you can think about it, is let's look at this, right? We start with a fluid of given saturation, of given salt content. We've chosen 28%, not because it's realistic, but because it makes it much easier to look at. Seawater, the 3% would be squeezed just somewhere to the side. So let's have a look at this. And let's see if I can run this. I quickly have to change the pointer, otherwise this doesn't work the way I want. So what happens is we start here with a fluid that's in the single phase regime, and then we increase energy. And with this increase in energy, I start again, temperature is rising, Now we are about to hit that phase field. That's the liquid plus vapor field. And as soon as we hit this, the fluid splits into a saline brine that goes along here. I hope you could follow. That's a brine phase that has all the salt and gets increasingly salty as you put in more energy. And the vapor phase, it kind of runs along here. The bulk composition is going up somewhere there. So we are with bulk, we are somewhere here. If you go a bit further, we now hit the three-phase conditions. We now hit with the bulk composition here the yellow field, that the liquid halide vapor coexistence. At this stage, all the salt is going into the solid, and that is what you're seeing here. The fluid is losing its salt, the brine is losing the salt into the solid, and the rest goes into the vapor, and temperature stays constant there. Then we keep on evolving. We are now in the vapor plus halide field. So we have a vapor phase that almost has no salt, and on the other side, it's all in the halide. And if you keep on going a little bit, we go back into the liquid plus vapor phase. What this means is, it's just one way of illustrating, and we actually come back to a similar case here when we look later at the Deiking event, where we also push fluids by putting energy into the system, into the different phase fields. What you can already see from doing this, and I changed the pointer again that you see it better, that at every stage, although bulk salinity is constant, we just stay at constant bulk salinity and increase energy, we have fluids of very different properties and salinities in the subsurface. At times, you have a heavy brine phase that maybe doesn't really want to move. Sometimes you have a solid halide field that doesn't really move. And then we have these vapor phases that has almost no salt and they really like to move. So that means as soon, you can already imagine, as soon as you put this into a transport model, all sorts of things will happen and you will keep changing salinity everywhere, which means intuition built on constant salinity or on the seawater phase diagram is likely to be misleading. Now, Falco Filling put this into the flow model so that we see how this translates into salt and heat transport. And this is just a generic model that illustrates how these multi-phase models work. Where at the bottom, we have a cold box initially, then we heat from the bottom. What happens then is that we push the fluids into the liquid plus vapor phase. The brine phase will accumulate at the base, being very saline, and the vapor phase wants to go up. And the initial stages of this results in very low salinity, vapor-like venting at the seafloor. With time, this progresses into a pseudo steady state. And this middle panel looks a bit boring, and that's interesting that it's boring. What happens is we form a stable brine layer at the bottom. And above these dark bluish colors, this is seawater salinity. And what happens there, you can see to the left, to the right, sorry, left and right is difficult. What you see here is a zoom up of this lower part. What happens is we have a stable stratification. At the bottom, we have this brine layer, which is in the two-phase regime. This is where liquid and vapor coexists. And the top of this brine layer is basically the phase boundary between the liquid plus vapor and the single phase liquid phase. What happens here is that we have single phase convection above, and we have stable stratification, or the salt stays behind. Under these conditions, the pure water model would not be that bad, because actually all the circulation is happening in the single phase field anyway. The interesting part starts when you do something to the heat source. Imagine like a slow spreading ridge where the heat is reduced because the driving gabbroic intrusion is progressively cooling. If you reduce the heat input, then this phase boundary moves further downward. So basically transition between single phase and liquid plus vapor is moving down. And as a consequence, parts of these brines enter the single phase domain and are then washed out. And this is like a very effective way of washing out the salt, and that might be related to some of the high salt contents in the vent fluids at slow spreading ridges. It's something known as brine flushing in some of the papers by the ETH group and by us. All right, this equation of state is amazing. I mean, we have spent hours, all of us, looking at them and being amazed how complicated it is. So Shikui has done his approach and took all of this and translated it in all sorts of implementations. Not all of that is done. You can already look for it on the App Store. That's pretty cool. It's all a bit beta stage, so, but it's coming. So you can already find on your iPhone, I think so far only, there's an app that you can do. There will be a desktop app coming. If you're into Python, you can already pip install it. There's no guarantee that everything works already, so don't blame us if something breaks. But Shikui is working hard of making all of these things work. I think he's almost done this. And then we will make it public and you can play with this. So I think it's really instructive to just play on this and see what happens if you increase temperature, if you switch between PTX and PHX. It's pretty cool. So stay tuned for that, and I hope this will come soon. Yes? All right. So much for the kind of tool sets and the different models we have. The question is how useful they are. What kind of questions can we address? And I want to show you a few examples, some older ones, some newer ones, on how you can use these models to understand mid-ocean ridge systems and their hydrothermalism attached. So one of these focus sites have been the East Pacific rise in 9 degrees north. This is Endeavour, this is a cover picture of this great special issue from the Ridge 2000 activities. And there have been all these review papers, all the different data sets on the East Pacific rise. And lately there has been the 3D seismic study by Milena Marjanovic and Omid Agai, and I think when Papu Canales was involved, Mladen Dimovic, really fantastic data sets on the seismic structure on the East Pacific rise. And some of those results show that in addition to the axial melt lens, you also have the sub-axial melt lenses, you have off-axis axial melt lenses, and there are other data sets on how the hydrothermal cooling looks like. And of course, like when I first saw these results, this of course triggers the association to the old debate on how fast-spreading oceanic crust accretes, if this is more in like a Gabbro glacier way, where all the lower crust is assumed to crystallize in a shallow melt lens, or the kind of Oman-inspired Peter Kellerman type accretion models on the many sills or sheeted sills for the lower crust. I guess we have always known that nature will operate somewhere in between of these end members, that they just help us to think about them. And I guess this is what these models tell us, that sometimes nature likes to do that, and sometimes nature likes to do something else. For us, from a modeling perspective, that raises the question, so what can we learn from this about the hydrothermal flow paths? So how would the cooling mode look like for models like that? And these are relatively straightforward, well-posed questions on how to do this. For example, you can say if everything crystallizes there, how do I get rid of the heat? And the more tricky question is, if everything crystallizes down there, how do I get rid of that heat? This. So what we have done is something that Sonja Tyson-Carr has done a while back with us, is to make models that balance the heat and hydrothermal cooling. And I admit this figure is a bit full. I hope you still get the main picture in the end. So the question we have been posing, inspired by this data, is what does a melt and placement tell us about the likely hydrothermal flow pattern? So how do we get rid of this heat? What these models are done, they have like a solid accretion component where we put in the melt in different ways, and then we have a solid mantle on crustal flow field associated with them. Putting the heat in and the new crust forming involves a diking region where we put in new material along the dikes, a melt lens where some of the lower crust is emplaced, and then a diking region below where, depending on the model setup, a fraction of the entire lower crust is building in a sheeted sill fashion. In most of the runs, what we do is we try to match the thermal structure that has been inferred from the seismic tomography from the old Dunn paper. This tomography has this hot slot, and you can look at the isotherms that are inferred from the seismic data, which have this kind of hot slot in the middle. There, no, it still works. I lost my mouse there. Okay, so what happens now is if you put all the heat in there, then you can imagine we need a bit less kind of cooling here to match that thermal structure. If you put all the heat inside here in a sheeted sieve fashion, a lot of latent heat is released and we need more intense cooling. This are snapshots from different results. The top one, I hope you can read this. The top one is pure Gabbro Glacier. All the heat is released in the melt lens. Then to get the isotherms inferred from the seismic tomography, we get a cooling pattern like this, very vigorous hydrothermal convection on top, and then a cross-axis component where we also get a little bit of deep cooling and we make the right thermal structure. The melt fractions, you cannot read the label, it doesn't matter, these yellow lines, they are high in the melt lens and then low below. From the seismic tomography, again, we know that the melt fractions are probably kind of lowish, maybe in the 25% regime. If you put more heat into this, then the melt fractions go up in the lower crust. And when you start to put 50% silts and 50% accretion in the melt lens, that's like the upper limit of what we think is thermally feasible and still matching these constraints. If you go to 75% silts, then it gets really hard to get rid of the heat inside the lower crust. And then you get these very high melt fractions. If you do the same thing for only cooling in the extrusives, so if you have cooling pattern only on top of the melt lens, then already putting 25% silts is like the maximum of what is compatible with the data. Otherwise, the melt fractions get too high. Yes? So what that means, that's sort of intuitive, that deep intrusions require deep hydrothermal cooling. It also means that the silt fraction is likely smaller than 50%. And it also means that as soon as we see these kind of shallow melt lenses below the, or like the subaxial melt lenses and off-axis melt lenses, so as soon as you see these intrusions in the seismic data, somewhere the lower crust or off-axis, it probably means that we also need some component of deep hydrothermal circulation. Yes? And that brings us back to a question that we addressed in this 2014 paper on how we kind of reconcile observations on deep versus shallow hydrothermal cooling. And there are many other data sets on that. For example, there is this nice thermobarometry from Fabrice Fontaine, where they look at the last point of fluid rock equilibration. And what they find is that most of the fluids don't show greater pressures than the melt lens, which would favor like purely above melt lens circulation. Then there are the Tolstoy paper on the microseismicity, also more favoring flow only above the melt lens. There's this cool new work that I mentioned from the EPR that also some people have put into models to show also preferential pathways and possible fluid pathways right above the melt lens. This. But then there are all these other constraints, like what I showed you just in a second, that as soon as we have things crystallizing further down and being placed further down in the structure, so basically in the lower crust, we need this deeper fluid flow. And there are also other constraints on that. For example, the old EPR seismic data. Again, when you go to the ophiolite complexes, you see fluid flow or hints for fluid flow all over the place, also in the lower crust. The cooling rates is a bit of a debate. Like some of the speedometry on crystal growth suggest very slow cooling rates in the lower crust, which would be incompatible with hydrothermal cooling down there or with some special kinds. But I think most of the evidence probably hints at some deep component. And this all then accumulated in this paper that I still really like from Jörg Hasenclever from 2014, where that was our vision of how we can use computer models to put all of that together. And basically the idea here is that you have two components of the flow system. You have an on-axis component that is driven by the heat or latent heat release in the melt lens. And then you have a cross-axis component where you have deep recharge and coming up. This would be these golden balls coming up there. All these fluid mix and then rise as a single fluid to feed the on-axis vent sides. If you remember, just quickly, I don't want to go into detail on this. If you remember what I said in the beginning about the thermodynamic properties of these pure water models, it's basically the free convection part, this red box, that's controlled by the fluid properties I mentioned. the deep part that goes up the ridge flanks, not flanks, like the edges of this hot slot, those guys are controlled by the permeability, and their upflow can be also at higher temperatures, basically all the way up to the brittle ductile transition. All right, so that was useful, or I hope useful implication. I hope you agree on using single phase models. So let's look at the new stuff. So what we also know, every once in a while, we get the chance to see how these hydrothermal systems respond to short-term variations. And that can be like a diking event, that could be an earthquake. Some of the groups, I really like that work on the tidal modulations on flow. So every once in a while, we can poke these systems and see how they respond. And one of these chances was the 2006 eruption on the East Pacific rise that actually buried some of the OBSs. And also there was a magmatic event in 91. And some of them, there are time series for how the vent fluids look. And for example, if you look here at the paper by Pester from 2014, you see the eruption here at 91, and what happens is right after the eruption, we have very low salinity fluids venting. Then about a year to two later, the salinities pick up. They actually overshoot over the seawater value. And then the P vent stays up there and the bio9 is going down. So basically we get this vapor phase where we have apparently vapors venting, then the brines are coming out, and then the system goes back to some new steady state. And here the question is, can we learn something from these perturbations? So what is actually happening inside these systems that make this signal? And for that, let's look again into one of these movies. Let's see if I can operate this. So think we are somewhere there. We have a background flow field where the fluid is circulating in some kind of single phase domain. Vent fluids would have seawater salinity, maybe 350 degrees venting, and we sit here at seawater salinity. Now the dike comes and we heat the system a little bit. What happens first is we again get into this liquid plus vapor phase. We split off a brine phase and a vapor phase. Then as soon as we hit, let this run a little bit, so the brine becomes more salty, we make more and more vapor, you see the saturations. Opala. And very soon we will get into this vapor plus halide phase. Now, at this case, we basically now make solid halide. We are at 460 degrees. So if the diking event manages to heat the fluids up to that temperature, we will precipitate solid halide, which doesn't go anywhere, but the vapor phase that really wants to go up. So at this stage, we will have venting of like low salinity vapors going up. If you say maybe 600 degrees is the maximum, that's a bit arbitrary, that value. But now we are cooling back down. So first we are still in the vapor halide. Now we get into the brine phase, Now what happens is, if you follow this dot here, during this cooling phase, these brines, they evolve along this phase boundary. And as they evolve along this phase boundary, they become less and less saline. I hope you see that, and my controls are not in the way. And what means then, that's a bit counterintuitive. These fluids, they cool down, but they become less and less saline, and that makes actually easier for them to flow. So when we are somewhere in this phase regime, that would be the situation where we can start to mobilize these brines out of the system. So if I could put this into his model, and the model is set up to look at what happens if we perturb the upflow zone by a diking event. And the way these models are set up, I switched the pointer type, the way these models are set up, that we can have a controlled background flow. Falco has done this by having a fluid source here that results in flow up and a fluid sink over there. So this induces some kind of convective motion with a given salinity and temperature. And then that system is perturbed by having a heat flux boundary condition at the side, where you get the heat in from a diking event. And then in this plot down here, we look at the bulk salt content 1-2 meters away from the dike. So if this is a dike, we kind of look at the profile that's going down here. The dike goes until 10 meters below the surface and starts down there. if you look at the phase relations down here, what is happening, you see in black the temperatures and in white the phase boundaries. You push the system very rapidly into the vapor plus halide field. And we have temperatures of 500 plus degrees down there. Yes? In this stage, the vapors really like to rise. And in the vent fluids, we go from seawater salinity down to very low salinities. The vent temperatures go up. Yeah? After some time, we reach peak thermal conditions, somewhere there. This, in this case, we get maximum for like 420 degrees venting. And then we start cooling again. And remember the movie before. We start cooling. At some point, we reach this other white line, and we go into the liquid plus vapor phase. Now that's what makes this patchiness. The brines are still really heavy. They don't really like to move. There's still a residual fraction in the relative permeability model. So we still have very low salinity venting. At some stage here, in this case, 2 years after the dike event, now these brines have cooled sufficiently, they become a little less saline and they start to move, and are starting to transport it by the flow towards the vent, and the salinity is going up. Then we keep on going, we get these high salinities, we cool into the single phase domain. Now the brines are really washed out. That explains these high salinity values, and then we go into the liquid phase over there, and we get profiles that start to look like the data we are seeing. These are like the 91 data behind there in these dots. So this is how these systems behave. What you can then do is to kind of try to fit these data a little bit better. And this is just modifying one parameter, for example. This is a salinity of the background fluids, the fluids that come from below. So that's the salinity of the background state of the kind of long-term baseline. You always go to very low salinities in here. That's given, and these salinity values are given by the equation of state. Then you go in here, the less saline the fluids are to begin with, the less high that peak is. How long that peak is a function of temperature, of permeability, and the relative permeability model. And by varying these numbers of like the temperature of the background flow, the salinity of the background flow, the background permeability, and the permeability model, you can start to match these values. And by that, you can drive these models to start to match the data. And then you get insights into the hydrological regime at depth and how the two phases working, what kind of phase assemblages we will have. And that can really tell you something about how these systems work. There's one note I want to make is when you look at what is happening there and how different all these salinities are, again, interpreting this with a constant salinity in like phase relations of just seawater will give you very misleading results. You really need to have all this transport and all the complexity together. Now to finish, I want to show you another example of model data integration on the take hydrothermal field on slow spreading ridges and how we can find flow solutions that may be able to explain some of the data we are seeing there. The TAC field is one of these type examples of a fault-controlled systems. It's associated with detachment faulting, at least the segment is undergoing detachment faulting. And what's nice about TAC is that there's so much data. So for such a system, this is probably the best studied of them. We have the most data, we have ODP drilling, we have 3D seismic reflection data, there are refraction experiment on the tomography. There's new AUV bathymetry data, there's time series on fluid chemistry, microseismicity, gravity magnetics, basically all the tool sets we have. What's also interesting is that it's an off-axis system, so the venting seems to be controlled by tectonics. There's detachment faulting, it's high temperature, and what we also see that the discharge rates are pretty high, and I will come to that in a point. There's this famous paper on interpreting the flow zone, and this again about drawing arrows. That one idea that how the system could work is that we have this cluster of microseismicity that tilts towards the tag location. So maybe this connects to a detachment up there. And one plausible scenario could be that maybe you have circulation recharge happening somewhere, and then hot fluids being channelized along preferential pathways towards tag, and for some reason would then deviate into the hanging wall to feed tag. That's a popular model. Maybe it's also correct, or at least tells us something about it. But the question is if this can work, or how easy this would work from a hydrothermal flow perspective. And there are a couple of problems that might be existing there. One is how deep we could keep permeability open, like how easy it is to bring fluids 6-10 kilometers into the seafloor. And if hot fluids really like to be pushed around, if hot fluids really like to travel along preferential pathways. There's one other feature about TAG in many of these high temperature systems. If you look at the paper by Baker on comparing inferred heat flux measurements and how much heat is released at ridges due to the accretion process, you find that TAG is very productive. And also the other ones are very productive, but these values are super high. And this L value here tells you if those systems were in steady state, you would have to pool the heat over this distance, like 80 kilometers of the segment. You would have to take all that heat if the system were in steady state and vent it at TAG. Now, I have no idea how fluids would be collected over 80 kilometers. So what that basically means is that these systems are not in steady state. They are driven by episodic intrusions. But somehow you still need to kind of collect fluids over a wider region. And we will come back to that point. Yes? All right. So like basically my motivation to go back to TAG was what was that paper that we published, where we looked on how we can deviate flow and make hot fluids travel along preferential pathways. And what we found in that paper is that you need very special conditions to do that. You can do it so that it works, but you kind of have to fine tune the models. And the problem is that these hot fluids, they really like to go up. And to make them go somewhere else, you need quite strong permeability contrasts. And as soon as you have strong permeability contrast, you get a lot of mixing in these fluids and you kill the high vent temperatures. So then with all of that in mind, we went back to the data. And the new data is really cool. So I will be quick now. I'm not sure if I'm in time or not. Yes? So I see the one person that I see in the audience, so I guess I better hurry up. So this is ship-based bathymetry on like a 40 by 80 scale about on the ridge segment. This already looks nice. And this is what in the old days we would have been very happy about. Ridge axis coming here, the TAG segment is a bit special and having this nose, it probably goes around like that. Let's zoom a bit more and I put the earthquakes on top from the DeMartin paper, color-coded for depth. You see how they really tilt towards the TAG segment. There's also this nose of seismicity coming in. And this is how it looks. Let's zoom a bit more. Now you see the cool AUV-based bathymetry. You see the corrugated surface where possibly detachment is cropping out. This. You have another probably older detachment up there. You start to see different domains. There's some hydrothermal activity here. You also see signs of magmatic activity in this corridor. You have this extensional zone where faulting is mainly northeast, southwest. Then we have another corridor, again, with more signs of magmatism where TAG sits. This. In the reflection data, this is from I hope I have the reference. I have the Zoom panel in front. This. That seismic line that you see up there, hopefully, that lies somewhere there. This. Going across these two corrugated surfaces and the detachment that you probably see somewhere there. That's extending from this one at depth. This. Unfortunately, there is 3D seismic data across all of that, but you basically lose a detachment somewhere there, whatever that means. So either the detachment is too deep beneath the TAG segment, or it's just not there, or it's maybe not active. And that's my favorite interpretation so far, that we are going into a state of renewed magmatic activity and leaving this detachment faulting mode. But this is a hypothesis. Let's zoom a bit more. What's interesting, you have these north-south trending fault systems, you have this corridor, and you have these additional faults down there. And right where these two sets of faults are intersecting, this is where TAG sits. So there seems to be a connection between the structures we see at the seafloor and where TAG sits. This kind of more bubbly thing is probably related to magmatism. This is sometimes interpreted as like a collapsed lava lake. So there's signs of renewed magnetic activity in there. Let's zoom out a little bit. Then I tried my very best to georeference the shower P-wave tomography. And you see these kind of slow anomalies centered beneath TAG. And what that means is that TAG is located on these cross-cutting faults. There's signs of a driving heat source below, at least there is a snow anomaly. And we at least have signs for the detachment faulting around. We also have very high discharge fluxes and the fluids saw no signs of interaction with an ultramafic source. And I think the more simple model to explain all of that is that we have a driving heat source as imaged in the tomography, that the detachment that might underlie the TAG segment is channelizing or organizing the recharge flow and not the discharge flow, and that the discharge is happening right above the heat source where the cross-cutting fault systems are making a preferential pathway. And we have put all of that into our new toolboxes that I mentioned earlier into this hydrothermal foam. You can make like geometric models. You can also use the snappy hex mesh tools to make super complicated meshes, meshing the bathymetry and everything. It's all open source. You can try it. So look at the links I provided earlier. If you put all of that together, you can create flow models like this, where our upflow zone would be like a preferential pathway. TAG would sit on top. We have a driving heat source below. And then a lot of the recharge is basically channelized and organized by this detachment plane below. And like this, you can pool heat, not 80 kilometers, but at least some kilometers along the axis. You can pool this heat and shoot everything out at TAG. And if you put everything together, we have all sorts of different interpretations and plots of that. You get venting, high temperature venting at TAG, and the recharge would happen partly where the detachment might be outcropping, and then kind of circulation and subsurface would look like this, pretty much like the movie I've shown you before. And for me and for us and everyone working on that, I hope I have convinced at least the people working with me that this makes a kind of more robust flow system, and that maybe there has been too much attention on pushing hot fluids around, and we should think more of recharge, discharge as connected. So that means with these new data sets, we can really make testable predictions. We can put all of that into flow models and see if they work or what doesn't work. And this is all about drawing better arrows. For these fault controlled systems, I think channeling hot fluids is really hard from the modeling perspective. Maybe that happens, but I've also seen from some of the other groups, there's fluid inclusion data. There are more data sets that show that maybe this pure hot upwelling along the detachments is probably not how these systems work. Yes? And for us, we get very robust 3D solutions, high discharge rate, high temperatures, and we pool the heat along the segment if we set it up in the way that we have a driving heat source below and the recharge is along the detachment fault plane. Now looking ahead, there's so much work left to do, fortunately, I guess, that one thing that's definitely on the agenda, we have to make the saltwater problem work and make it more accessible. There are several groups that can do it now. We are doing it. I know there are cool 3D models in the pipeline that will come up on that, but one has to admit that it's a pain to do that. It's really a lot of work to making that work. And I think as a community, we need to get this into open source. We need to get people together to make that problem tractable. We cannot always have like a PhD suffer for 3 years to get one multi-phase simulation. So that's really something that needs to be done better. And something I noticed, and that's why I originally went into this multi-phase, that we as a modeling community, and maybe I should just blame it on me, is that sometimes we tend to make models that cannot be compared to data in the way that we make predictions on things that we don't measure. Yes? And I think we have to make a better job there. And things I have in mind is, for example, that we are starting to work on hydrothermal plumes going up in the water column, that maybe we can better connect what we measure in the water column to what's below the seafloor. Also, if I look at some of the feedbacks between reactions and flow and the fluid rock interaction, those things need to be resolved on a kind of porous scale, on the pore scale. And you see an example over there. We are starting to get into this digital rock physics of trying to understand fluid rock interaction really in lab experiments on the pore scale, trying to understand that from a numerical point of view, and then maybe upscale this to be used on different ways. I also think that these bulk porosity models that we are always using, this is not how it works. I'm pretty sure this just flows along discrete fractures, and we need to get that into the models in a better way. And finally, I have some, I mean, there are many open questions, but for me, it's really striking that all these active vents, they have such high heat output, and we have such a hard time making that work in the models. So I think understanding what makes these high heat outputs, be it that this is all intrusion driven or that there are some fancy permeability models that make that work, we need to get that under control. We need to resolve the discrepancy and also look at feedbacks between mineralization and fluid flow, and definitely interrelations between tectonics and hydrothermal flow, something that I think really plays a role in these systems. That was my part. I hope I could convince you that models can be useful for understanding these systems and for putting context to the various measurements we do on hydrothermal systems. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you very much, Lars. That was a very exciting talk and certainly out of my zone of comfort a lot.